Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's presentation and panel. My name is Catherine Brown, and I'm the Vice President for Education Policy here at the Center for American Progress. Today, we are excited to host an esteemed panel and release a new report examining the opportunities states and districts have to improve their assessment systems under the new Every Student Succeeds Act. With this new law comes an opportunity and responsibility to develop better testing systems without the pressure of NCLB's sole focus on summative test performance. States and districts will now have more room to innovate and streamline their testing systems that all too often were burdensome for students, parents, and teachers in the past. This new flexibility comes after a clear backlash against standardized testing that has been simmering for the past 18 months. In states like New York, Washington, Oregon, and New Jersey, parents proactively kept their children from taking end-of-year exams in large numbers. In fact, New York alone had 20% of its students opt out of the test, and Oregon saw over 5% of their eligible students opt out of end-of-year exams. In October of 2014, CAP released a report looking at the amount of time that students spend taking standardized tests. We found that in school districts, actually only 1.6% of instructional time was devoted to testing. However, we also found that the frustration surrounding testing in communities was very real. So we set out in this new report to determine the root causes of those problems. Over a 6-month span, we interviewed dozens of parents, teachers, school leaders, system leaders, advocates, assessment experts, and policy leaders in an attempt to identify what can be done to ensure that tests are used effectively and sparingly. We also conducted parent focus groups in 3 locations: Westchester, New York, Boston, Massachusetts, and Dallas, Texas. There were 2 focus groups held in each location, one comprised of predominantly upper-income parents and another one with predominantly lower-income parents. We also conducted a 4-week testing diary study during testing season with 194 parents. We asked parents about their children's experiences with various state tests and received real artifacts of communication about assessments from schools and school districts to parents. We held small focus groups of teachers from California, Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Virginia, asking them about their experiences with assessments. And finally, we held more than 20 interviews with assessment experts, state and local leaders, policymakers, and district assessment coordinators around the country. In short, here's what we found. First, communication about tests is insufficient. To the extent that it occurs at all, communication focuses on logistical details, such as when the tests will occur, and provides superficial guidance like make sure your child eats breakfast, and not on more important questions like why are the tests being administered and how will the results be used. Second, all too often summative state assessments are not aligned with the district's curriculum. Tests that are not aligned lead to confusion among teachers about what topics to focus on and drive test prep activities that are separate from high-quality instruction. Third, too much test prep is occurring. Around 60% of parents reported that their child participated in some sort of test prep at least once during our study, and 15% of parents reported that their child participated in test prep more than 3 times during the test period. And finally, poor logistics and the limits of technology often lengthen testing windows and create major disconnects between taking a test and seeing the results. By disrupting the schedule of all students in a school, long testing windows have created the impression that tests take up much more time than in reality they actually do. In general, we found that parents have a relatively nuanced understanding of tests and want them to continue to be part of their child's educational experience, but they don't see much utility in the tests for their children. Parents in our focus groups thought that tests should provide a useful check on the system as well as on their child's school, provide reliable information about how students are performing and ensuring that their children are on track to graduate high school, career, and college ready, provide comparable data for subgroups of students in order to allow system leaders to identify achievement gaps, and enable tailored instructional practice, inform prioritization of resources and interventions for schools and classrooms that are struggling. After hearing from stakeholders about the problems with the system, we looked at how state and districts can transition to a clearer, simpler, and more intentional system, where tests offer valuable feedback on what students have learned throughout the course of the year. Our paper sets out a roadmap for school and district leaders to create stronger systems of teaching and learning, where tests are one important and useful component. The roadmap and recommendations relied on best practices that a handful of states and districts are already implementing, including Commissioner Elia's efforts in New York and Superintendent Bigger's work in New Mexico that we'll hear more about in a moment. We looked at Governor Hickenlooper's efforts in Colorado last year to pass legislation that improved the quality of tests while simultaneously reducing the number of tests. We studied efforts in states like Illinois and Tennessee, who established assessment task force made up of teachers, parents, experts, and stakeholders who use the inventory tool developed by Achieve to eliminate unnecessary and redundant tests and develop a protocol for schools and districts to remain vigilant about the amount of testing they require. In addition to Superintendent Bickert's district, other school districts have also proactively addressed the overtesting issue. In Tulsa, for example, Superintendent Deborah Gist launched an assessment study group that was tasked with looking at the district's use of tests and their purpose. As a result, they announced that students will spend 54% less time on tests in the 2015-2016 school year. Unfortunately, these efforts are the exception and not the rule. But now that the NCLB testing framework has been lifted and the new law gives states the room to innovate, we predict that we will see a lot more states and localities doing similar things. In our report, we outline a set of short and long-term recommendations for schools, districts, states, and the federal government to move towards a robust, coherent, and aligned system of assessments that measure student progress with actionable information to ensure students are on track to graduate, prepared for college and a career. For example, at the state level, policymakers should ensure that test results are delivered in a timely fashion so that parents and teachers can act on them if needed and have this written into testing contracts. At the district level, administrators should undertake a meaningful process of audits to take stock of which tests are being administered and identify ones that are duplicative and can be eliminated. At the school level, students' test prep activities like rallies and teaching to specific test items should end. And at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Education should do more to disseminate thoughtful assessment practices to states and ensure that the tests provide real value to parents and students. These are just a few of the recommendations, and making better, fairer, and fewer tests a reality will take longer than 1 year, but it has to start this school year. Again, we see this new law as an opportunity to innovate towards better, fewer, and fairer assessments that are a tool for teaching and learning and not testing for testing's sake. Our panel here today has a lot of experience with this issue at various levels, including Chris Burbfalk, who's a teacher here in DC Public Schools, George Bickert, a superintendent from Ruidoso, New Mexico, Commissioner Elia, the Commissioner of New York's Department of Education, Mike Cohen, the president of Achieve, who's played an integral role in advising states on assessments, and Janelle George, the Senior Education Policy Counsel at the NAACP. And of course, Chris Minnick, the Executive Director of the Council for Chief State School Officers, who is an expert on assessments himself and the former Director of Test Design and Implementation at the Oregon Department of Education, is going to be moderating the panel. And with that, I invite our panelists up to the stage, and I invite you all to follow along with today's conversation at #TestBetter. Thanks so much, Chris, for getting the conversation started.
All right. Who wants to talk about tests? Yeah, this is exciting. I was disappointed to see that there's going to be no more pep rallies. That just seems like something we need more of in schools, is more pep rallies. But anyway, good morning. I'm Chris Minnick. I'm the Executive Director of the School Superintendents, State Superintendents Association. Commissioner Elia is a member of our organization, and we're excited to be here to have this conversation today. I think one of the things, as I read the report, was how true many of the recommendations in here really rang for me about what states are beginning to do. Some states have already stepped in and done some of these things, but I think it's a really good report. If you haven't read through it, I would suggest doing so, because I think it's got very good recommendations for what we can do going forward. And as we step into this conversation, I think it's really important to sort of level set around that. I think we all believe that we need some measure of how kids are doing, whether it be every year. We believe it should be at least once a year. And I think as a parent, I would like to know how my students are doing at least once a year. So I think it's a really important conversation to make sure that we minimize the amount of testing that's going on, but at the same time we provide good information for parents. And so that's sort of how I want to lead into this conversation. I think we'll start with Janelle and Mike. So why all the pushback against tests? Like, why are we doing this? Why is there pushback? What's the value of even engaging in this conversation for kids? So, Janelle, you want to start?
Sure, and thanks, Chris, and thank you for having the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund participate in this conversation. So the Legal Defense Fund, or LDF, is well known for its litigation work, including litigating Brown versus Board of Education. So addressing educational inequities is a really high priority for LDF, and I actually have to say some of the pushback is warranted. A lot of the concerns about lack of quality assessments, lack of transparency of how testing data is used. We have seen school pushout where students have been disproportionately impacted by disciplinary policies in order to boost test scores, unfortunately artificially, where teachers have really been penalized. So this test and punish culture has really cultivated this resistance and these concerns. And LDF has certainly never supported high stakes testing tied to high stakes decisions like grade promotion. However, we do support culturally competent, high quality assessments that are aligned with quality standards, aligned with what students are actually learning in the classroom, that are also part of multiple measures of assessing and evaluating student performance. And I also want to add as well, it's important to inform parents, have more transparency, what's being done with the test results, ensuring that the results are timely and they're actually used to inform interventions, supports, programming. But again, the test and punish culture has really warranted a lot of honestly well-deserved criticism, because when tests are improperly used, what we see is disparities are actually deepening. And we're missing the fact that assessments can actually provide important information and expose inequities and help to target resources. But we really have to get back to the issue of quality assessments that are aligned with challenging academic standards, and that again inform interventions and supports that don't penalize teachers or students or schools.
So Mike, what's your perspective on that?
It's reasonably similar to Janelle's, but a couple of differences here. First of all, let's just to put this in context, I think. With ESSA enacted now, this is an opportunity for state and local leadership, right? And I think we need states and local leaders to actually step up to the plate here. We need high quality tests. It means aligned to the standards. It means they've got, particularly given the standards that we're measuring, they need to have real performance components to them. These can't all be multiple choice tests. For example, it's hard to imagine an English language arts test these days that does not require students to write, yet we've got an awful lot of them that don't require students to write. But there are other kind of performance components to tests that are going to be important as well to reflect critical thinking and problem solving skills. So quality is important, and we know what it looks like, particularly for summative tests, but it's not the common practice just yet. Secondly, I think we need to dial back the pressure that we've linked to tests, right? I'm not sure that it's merely a problem of a punish culture, a test and punish culture, but I do know that as the pressure associated with test results increases, right, part of the response in many districts and schools to that, right, is to give more tests to better predict how the final results, right, the summative results will be, to focus more on test prep than on high quality instruction, right? And then, Chris, for your benefit, to throw in the pep rallies also to really get everybody prepared to do well. So I think it's a combination of the pressure on the tests and the way in which local educators often either choose to or feel forced to respond to those. What's most important, though, is that we make sure that the tests that are given actually have value for kids and parents, which means providing actionable information, door opening rather than door closing tests. So we've studied high school graduation tests. By the way, those that are out there still don't measure very rigorous skills, right? But high school tests that tell students whether they are prepared to enter credit-bearing courses in college and opens the door to college to them, right, are the kinds of value propositions that we need to provide. Now, we also need tests for accountability and equity purposes, right? Without tests, we would not be able to identify achievement gaps. We would not know whether all students, right, particularly from various backgrounds, are getting the opportunities that they need. So we do need to keep a testing regime in place that will provide valuable information to policymakers, to leaders, to taxpayers, et cetera. One challenge is it is difficult to create summative tests that provide all the information you want to inform instructional decisions, that gives parents all the information that they need, right, and also provides the policy and accountability information that's needed, and do that in a limited amount of time, which means we need to rely on multiple measures, we need to rely on other kinds of indicators, and we've got a lot of work to do to get ready for that.
You know, the irony for me about the punish piece is the states really haven't done much punishing. It's the perceived punishing that is going, like, so the teachers step up their and schools step up their concern level because the perception is that these tests mean a lot, and the grading and things like so it's all public sort of shaming stuff that's going on, but the consequences in the end have been very light. I mean, if you go through NCLB, it had to take 6 years for a school to really get the restructure. And so for me, as a former state person, I felt like we weren't really doing a lot of hardcore restructuring, but we were trying to make these tests into something bigger than they actually were. And so anyway, we can talk about that. So Mary Ellen and George from the ground. So in New York and New Mexico in your district, so Janelle talked about some positives of why we need these assessments. So talk a little bit about what you're seeing in your state and in your district about these tests, and what are the things that you think need to change in order to move this forward?
So let me say, I think that that what Janelle's pointing out, that whole punishment approach, whether it is perception has become reality. Okay.
I got you.
And when you and New York is a good example. The tests and the performance of students on tests was tied to teacher evaluation. That set the stage for a very intense, charged environment, and people, parents, teachers, administrators reacted to that, and I think it caused people to take tests and put them out of perspective. And so we really don't have a clear view of how we're using them. We haven't done, and I would say that the report that came out from the Center for American Progress is an excellent document. And it really hits on, I was reading through it when I got my copy, and I thought, my goodness, this is like a prediction of the things that I've heard in New York. And so I think one of the things is that I'm hearing that the tests are too long and that people are using too much of the time. We did an assessment a year ago. Every district was asked to determine how many assessments they were giving, and really pare back to less than 2% of the year. But that really doesn't play out well in parents' minds and in teachers' minds. And when you say it's going to be 2%, then what does that include, right? So I think we've gotten off a really strong discussion of how we use assessments and the value of an assessment for a teacher. And part of that is teachers understanding and using an assessment to really drive how they're instructing in their classroom and who needs support and help. And then you get to, well, what assessments are really used that way, and then if you get your data back in such a lengthy time period after the assessment is given, that's a problem. In New York, it was long. We we've got it down to, getting the data back. We hope this year it'll be before the teachers leave for the summer at the end of June, but it's still too long. Part of it is, and it was mentioned in the report, the issue of not having technology when you really need technology to work for you, right? And doing that, I think, will be a big bonus. So there's so many things that we hear. Much of it has just been taken kind of and blown out of perspective, but you understand why. And I think we've just got to become very proactive, use the recommendations that are in here and other things that we're hearing from our parents and our teachers and our administrators, and help them to put this back in perspective.
George?
Chris, good morning. Good morning, everyone. And I want to thank the center for having me here today. One of the interesting things when we talk about high stakes in our state and in other states, for instance, we have school report cards. And so when parents want to check out how a school is doing in our state, at the elementary and middle school level, 90% of the points come from high stakes testing, come from a combination of both our Common Core tests last year, which was PARCC, and statistical analysis of the 2 previous years of our state test, the standards-based assessment. So at the high school level, I believe it's 60 to 65%. So how your school is perceived by the public, and we talk about that perception, is significantly impacted by those test scores. And again, as the commissioner said, most states went to a teacher evaluation system that included student achievement measures. And again, states were allowed to choose the math that they use with value-added models and other things. And in New Mexico, 35 to 50% of an individual teacher's evaluation is now related to that test score. And one of the other things that we have seen, and Chris and I were talking about this before we came out here, is that these tests last year, at least across our states and in other places, very much indicated the socioeconomic gap in education. We call it the achievement gap, but when you look at demographically, when you look at socioeconomic status, that is one of the primary gaps that exists in education. And this test this year, at least among the states I'm familiar with in the PARCC system, was very clear that there was an economic gap.
So I hear clearly some of the challenges, and I think we would all, it sort of plays out in the report as well. Everybody sort of laid some of the challenges on the table. So I want to go to Chris, talk about your experience in DC and how you've sort of, as a teacher, elementary school teacher, you've received these assessments and how this transition has been, and what do you think of the new assessments, those types of things that DC is doing. And also, what are some solutions from a teacher's perspective about what would make it more useful for you?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I do want to start by addressing the punishment perception and then the very real punishment reality that's taking place in DC. If you follow up on what was just said, if you look at DC scores, the only 14 schools had more than 50% of their students proficient on our last test. If you look at those 14 schools, most of them don't have a single subgroup. And only 2 of them had an economically disadvantaged subgroup that you could report on. And when you look at that gap in those 2 schools was 60 points, an average of 60 points. So there's a very real reality that you're rewarding and punishing based on the students that attend your school. And what that means for the students and the classrooms, in DCPS we have 100 schools, we have 60 charter schools. Since 2008, 30 DCPS schools have been closed, and almost the same number of charter schools have been closed. So the punishment aspect is a very real reality for these families and students when they are faced every day with, number one, their school being closed or their school threatened to be closed. And in the classroom, I taught 5th grade in Anacostia. The median income was $13,000 compared to Ward 3, where it's $257,000. Our school was on a list to be closed. In 5th grade, 50% of the students I had were not at that school the prior year. 80% were not at school in 3rd grade. What that means is that these policies in closing the schools because of the punishment aspect has taken the most marginalized students, the students at the wrong end of the achievement gap, the students at the furthest behind, and made them educational transients, where they bump from school to school to school, oftentimes during the middle of the year, and it prevents schools from providing the wraparound support services that those students really need, because they're always moving from school to school to school. In conversations with parents on home visits, I find out that even at the level of a family, you've separated the brothers and sisters into different schools. And that just is devastating for what happens to them. We take away their school, their playground, we take away their teachers. The very next year in third grade, a charter school 3 blocks away closed, and then a charter school 1 block the other way decided we need to reboot because we're not successful. So they emptied their school and started over with pre-K. All those students are thrown to the wind and then have to try to find a charter school or a neighborhood school. It separates the families, and for the reason I just said, it causes those problems. And then if you look even deeper, the punishment perception in reality is present in a very different way for students. Schools are fight every year to gain a few percentage points to stay open. Administrators and teachers' jobs are on the line. At one point, my evaluation was 45% of my evaluation was based on test scores. They fight for a few percentage point gains. What that means is that schools focus in on the kids who are on the cusp, who are almost proficient, or the kids who sometimes the word is we call them bubble kids. We're on the bubble of being proficient. If we can focus in and move a few of those kids to proficient, then we can keep our school open, people can keep their jobs. For the students who are the furthest behind, they are pushed to the side by that policy, and they are left further behind, and then you see that in the data. It bears out in the data. If they're not proficient or close to proficient in third grade, you look at the middle school, their middle school and high schools. We have a number of schools on the last assessment where not a single student was proficient. Not a single student was proficient. Half the schools, less than 50% were proficient. So I think those are issues. And then the way that those tests, the high stakes tests, we talked about the pep rallies. I taught 4th grade last year. We have 5 of these testing windows. They're 2 or 3 weeks long. During that time, recess is banned. The reason is because a student is taking a test, and we need that point so badly. If they hear another child or a child playing at recess or having fun, it could distract them from taking that test and getting those few extra points. So for 5 times, 3 weeks at a time, recess was banned. Specials, all special classes were stopped. No art, no music, no library, no foreign language. Those teachers were, first of all, we can't have mobility. Can't have students moving during the testing period, so they're locked down. And then those teachers are taken out of the classroom to use as proctors. So instruction essentially stops for these students. Now, my daughter is not at a high-need school. She's in a public school in the city. She's in the Ward 3, where the median income is $257,000. She gets extra recess when they release because they don't have that same accountability or pressure to earn those test scores. So I feel like this policy has hurt the students who are the furthest behind. In terms of solutions, I think number one, we stop the punishment aspect. We have to stop it. Number two, we look at different metrics. I think there's a place for keeping achievement gaps on the radar screen. We need to hold the country accountable for making sure every child succeeds. So there's a place for that. But then in terms of getting data, I would be thrilled to have a growth metric where we have an assessment that finds out where students are. We find those strengths. On the last one, this last standardized accountability test, 53% of 8th graders in math were a level 1. For a level 1, there's no performance descriptor. There's nothing. If you're a level 2, 3, 4, or 5, there's a very high level. This is what your student can do. This is what your student's doing. For level 1, nothing. They don't write a performance descriptor for level 1. So there's no information. It's useless for the actual student. It's useful for closing schools, but it's useless for students.
I think, I think some of those things you brought up we should be figuring out who's making those decisions, because I don't know that they're necessarily driven by policy. They're driven by somebody deciding recess wasn't a good idea for a set of kids because they needed to be tested, or they need. I mean, so we've got to figure out also on the testing side how we get smarter, but we've also got to deal with these policies. I mean, there's no reason why we should be doing that.
I agree.
So,
Yeah,
I mean, whoever's making that decision, I think we need to say that's wrong. So that's just my perspective.
But I think that the problem is that some of these policies have unintended consequences, and we said it's a culture, and they filter down and they affect students in ways that were never intended.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that's just the reality that's caused
Right.
by that perception.
So Janelle, you must be at the, in your job, there's this conflict, I imagine, between sort of seeing what he just said, and that there's a lot of reality to that, and then also saying, but if we don't have good information on our kids, they're going to be forgotten, or they're going to be left out of this system. So can you talk about that conflict?
Sure. And Chris, you use the word conflict. I don't know if I would frame it as a conflict. This is more about looking back at what education is truly about. And education is really about learning. And I want to actually pull from the report, and I'm quoting this, but tests and student performance on tests are not a goal in and of themselves. Instead, tests are but one relatively small tool that should be used in service of the real goal, which is learning. So I think we have to get back to the purpose of education, which should be driving quality instruction, and move away from, again, what was, especially under No Child Left Behind, this very real test and punish culture where we saw school closures, where we saw school discipline disparities, where students were being pushed out. We really have to, and I love the title, Mend It, Don't End It, because that's really about fixing the problem so that we can have a real conversation about things like quality instruction, deeper learning, addressing resource inequities, addressing racial and socioeconomic inequalities. Let's move the conversation there. Let's fix some of these tests. Let's get high quality, better assessments that are aligned with curriculum, that are culturally relevant, that are timely and instructive, and let's move on to the business of instruction and learning and giving students, all students, a quality education that they really should receive. Again, I don't see that as a conflict. I see it as a real goal of education, is driving equity. But what we saw under No Child Left Behind was actually deepening disparities. Thankfully, the Every Student Succeeds Act no longer mandates testing that ties evaluations to things like teacher test scores. It moves away from this high stakes testing approach. It also includes 95% participation rate. And the disparities that we see are not just on socioeconomic or racial lines, they're also impacting students with disabilities. So we see this 1% cap on alternative assessments for those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. These are the kind of things that are really important to drive equity and ensure that we don't see some of these unintended consequences.
Mike, you guys have been working with states on the audits. Catherine mentioned those in the opening. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen as you've worked with states? And then, Mary Ellen, I'm going to come to you and talk about what New York's done on reducing some of the testing.
Sure. For those of you who don't know, about a year ago, Achieve began to work to develop a local district assessment audit tool. Right, we did this, actually, you don't know this, but this idea sprung from a hearing that I was at in New York State, where I was there to testify about the Common Core and Park, and sat through a day of people complaining about too much attention on testing, and all of a sudden it hit me. Most of the testing time and tests that they're complaining about are local. We need some mechanism for figuring out what's going on there. I have never had a committee chair's eyes light up as much, right, as Senator Flanagan's did, when I sort of went off script and said, would it be a good idea to have an audit tool so people can figure out what's going on? So that was our strategic planning process to create that that tool. But we've been working.
Glad New York provided that opportunity for you.
Yes. Well, we're always thankful. So we've learned a number of things. We've been, first of all, the tool has gotten widespread use. It's on our website. It's an open resource. Do what you want with it. We've got training materials that go along with it. We have worked in a handful of places, in a handful of states, and a handful of districts in those states. to help them use the tool and to learn from it. So there are a couple of things that we've learned from this. One is oftentimes this is the first conversation that a group of stakeholders in a district have had about what testing we're doing and what its purposes are. And beneath that surface, you can tell there's not a lot of assessment literacy, right? It's not rampant in districts. People don't understand exactly what purposes different tests use. So there's a need for teachers, parents, and everyone else involved to have a better understanding of what's in place and what its intended uses are. Secondly, in most districts, they found any number of tests, right, where once they looked at them, they realized they were either not aligned to the standards or they were not providing useful, actionable information to teachers, and they got rid of them. Thirdly, when you bring a whole group of stakeholders together, right, it's helpful to have somebody, the superintendent, the school board, right, that basically expects action out of the process. This is not just an interesting discussion to have, right? There's got to be some, pardon the expression, pressure, right, to actually make some decisions here and to clarify and reduce testing. But where that happens, you actually see some significant reductions in testing. Another thing we saw is that in states that were transitioning from one summative test to another, or in states where the legislature had made the summative testing regime quite uncertain, people were reluctant to let go of anything that they had until they knew what the end game was going to be. So oddly enough, the debates that were going on in the state legislature often made it harder to address the issues at the local level. So those are some of the lessons that we've learned. We are starting a new phase of this work in partnership with the National School Boards Association to train local school boards in how to look at the assessments that we're doing. So they drive a lot of the need for testing. They can drive local superintendents to engage in this, and they probably have something to do with some of the policies that need to be addressed. So we think there's a opportunity for learning and for leverage there.
Good. Mary Ellen, you want to talk about New York's process and how you're thinking about reducing testing?
Yeah, so we did do an audit with my predecessor, John King, and I think that was very helpful in that people started to look at what was actually happening in the classrooms. And, you know, it kind of hit with this wave of people thinking, how much time are we really spending on testing? And then looking at it and realizing, oh my goodness, that's a lot of time. And this kind of test prep, and what are we doing to get kids ready for the test, which might not be connected to what it is they were going to see in that test. But the new tests in New York are related to the standards. And so we had tests that weren't, but people may have thought they were, maybe bought them thinking they were, and they really weren't. So I think it was an eye-opener. And so then the regents worked in, and that now is the accepted thing, that we have a cap on the percentage of time spent on assessments. But I think you get away from really how you can use assessments and what assessments can do. And so it's become almost a bad word. But in reality, for a teacher, if you think about it, it's great to know where your kids are, so you should be assessing kind of regularly on how you know kids are getting what you need, and if they aren't, what are you going to do to help them, right? And so in New York, I think we are on the way. I mean, I've been in this job now for 7 months and spent a lot of time traveling throughout the state and talking to various groups. And I would suggest that there's a major focus, as was pointed out earlier in the comments. New York had a 20% opt-out rate statewide, the highest in the nation. And that comes from poor communication across the board, not unlike other places, but it became a major focus in New York. And that we really did have so much stress on this single assessment that took the eye off of what was really happening. And I think we quickly got into some habits in schools, in classrooms that really, just didn't really focus on children anymore and focused on assessment. And so now we're backing up, moving more towards what I would say hopefully is a more reasoned approach, and trying to make sure that our teachers are very involved. Teachers really perceive these things were moving forward. Assessments were done. They weren't part of it. There was some involvement, but not enough. And we've changed a lot of that. We've shortened our assessments. So every grade level 3 through 8 in ELA and math will have a shorter assessment. We've opened up the opportunities for students who are productively working at the end of the time given that they can continue working. There's a number of other things that we're hoping to be able to move towards. And a major part of this, I believe, is really working with teachers so that they and their principals understand what's the use of an assessment, how it can be part of an overall instructional plan, and how it should connect. And the big part for us is making sure that the assessment isn't the end result, right? That is only one piece of what learning should be. And I think we get back to what you said. It's really important that the end result is learning for students, and the use of assessments to inform that is extremely important. A single assessment on any single day, when we all know children can be in various minds that day, feeling sick, whatever, the stress on them, we've got to get this rolled back so that we can be appropriate in our approach.
Yeah, and so I'll come back to you, but I want you to think about, the whole panel think about, does that mean more shorter tests? Does that mean, what are some things that we should be talking about? But I want George to talk about, in your district, you guys have done some really innovative things in thinking about how you give better information back to kids, parents, teachers in a quicker way. So would you talk a little bit about that, and what are some of the keys of that
And I want to start off
process?
with something very controversial. Learning can and should be fun. And that's, and in the process that we've done, that's what we've tried to do. Our mini assessments, and we don't call them that for students. We talk to students about things, show us what you know. Let's work on trying to score more points. And when kids see that process, we know how high stakes tests are at our level, as superintendent level, even as a teacher level. But I think one of our primary responsibilities is to take as much pressure off our kids as possible. And so what we've done is try to create an environment literally of fun, whereas we celebrate great scores, but we also celebrate something we call all-time bests. If you are only scoring 2 or 3 points a week on the mini assessment and all of a sudden you score a 4 or 5, we celebrate that all-time best so that a student feels really good for even a small measure of growth and improvement. And so that type of environment exists in our schools because we do believe that, and we don't want students feeling overwhelmed with the high-stakes testing. And it's a process, and in the report it talks about our math monsters and brave readers, and it was something that I started when I was a principal in public schools on the Navajo Nation and had great success with. And the kids love doing their assessments this week and love seeing how many points they scored and graphing their points and seeing their growth and seeing how their classes were doing. And so, and the other thing that we do in our mini assessments, we're assessing our students where they're getting immediate feedback in 24 hours. Our teachers are getting information back in 24 hours in that, we're assessing our students' learning, we're assessing our teaching so we can make adjustments. So we have both things going on at the same time. And in our parent-teacher conferences, our students talk to their parents about how they're doing on their very mini assessments. But again, we give them a different name. We call them math monsters or brave readers. And at our primary school, we warrior readers. And so we try and take that stigma off testing and assessments and put it into a fun learning environment.
Interesting. So I want to start with you on this, Chris. So thinking about more of the flexibility is going back to states to design these systems now, right? So there are some guardrails in the new federal law, but states do have some flexibility. They have to give tests every year. They have to make sure that they're part of a school accountability system and all that, but they have some flexibility to add other measures in. So if you were designing this system, what are the types of things? And one of the things I mentioned was, maybe more shorter tests, but that's one idea that I've heard. There's lots of possibilities here. What are some things that strike you as a teacher that would be helpful in that environment?
Well, I think first, removing the high stakes is first. But I agree with Janelle, and I think what's been said is accountability tests that can measure achievement gaps are really important, and they should continue. So if I was to look at a report as a parent, as a teacher, that we get back from standardized tests, it would have a grade level test that shows what the disparity is, shows where your student is. But then we're also looking at growth tests, right? So, the grade level tests, they don't offer any information for kids who are below grade level. But if you have a growth test that we could use on the same report that could say, look, we've identified where your student is, where their strengths are, where they're beginning to access the curriculum, where they're struggling, and where they're just not there, then that provides useful information for the teacher and the parent to build a relationship together, to foster learning and promote the growth that was being talked about. I think the other thing I'm really excited about as a teacher is that we have adaptive personalized learning tools now that we can blend in the classroom. The thing that's special about that is it allows kids to see a direct connection between what they do every day and then what the assessments are. I think that these high-stakes assessments, there's no translation for the child between what they're doing in class and what happens on that one day of the year. So it's really not meaningful to them. But I also think one of the most important things is, in our current system with grade level tests, we're evaluating schools that are in two different socioeconomic classes the same. And that's just not, I think it's good to get the achievement gap, but then it's really not helpful all the time. We could keep the achievement gap, but then we could have a multi-tiered system where schools have different goals that are differentiated towards focusing in and growing their students. And I think the last part is we need to put something in place that prevents districts from showing growth on accountability tests because their population changes. I think that's a significant issue. If you close, if you just like it's a fourth grade math lesson, you have 10 test scores, 3 are zeros. You move those students to another classroom, and then you pull in 3 students who are going to get an 80, you've increased your class average. You've shown all this growth, but the individual students haven't done anything different. And I think at our current accountability system, it's possible for for districts to say, we've had this great growth, look at us. We've grown by 25 points, 28 points, but then if you look at the actual students, no single student has a 28-point growth. Some grew 10, some grew 5. It's really come because they changed their population. So I think that's the protection we have to put in place, because we don't want to provide an incentive to reward, even with the best of intentions, to reward pushing some students away and then trying to draw other students in, because the focus is off the students now. It's on accountability. And I think that's something that we really have to protect against.
Yeah, I'd love for you to think about, we've struggled with this in designing systems ever since the beginning of No Child Left Behind. So think about possible solutions there. One is to just exclude those kids from the accountability system. That creates different challenges, because then the most mobile kids are outside of, then there's no incentive for the schools to serve those kids. So we could talk through possible solutions.
I think cohort data is a really interesting concept.
3 years of
right,
data,
but you track the same kids, so we really focus in and we hold states accountable for each student that they have, rather than some overall number that can be artificially changed.
That makes good sense.
Chris,
So, yeah, John.
can I just add one thing? I think that, again, we see some of those consequences when we focus on tests as an end in and of themselves. But one thing I do want to underscore is we have to account for, and we mentioned earlier some of the socioeconomic inequalities, but a lot of the resource inequities that we see. What are the drivers of some of the outcomes and the results that we see? For instance, we at LDF, we actually still have a pretty large open desegregation docket, and we have litigators who do site visits, and there's a school, elementary school, that literally has about 8 computers. And so during the testing window, the students will rotate and use the different computers because they don't have the access.
Yep.
And the students aren't going home. Often they don't have access to broadband, so they're not getting the ongoing exposure and interaction with the computerized assessment. So what we see and what we have to be mindful of and account for is how do these resource inequities contribute to or impact some of the testing results and some of the outcomes that we're seeing. If a student has limited exposure to a computer and you're taking a computerized assessment, you might not really be assessing their substantive knowledge. They could really have a strong understanding of the substance but not perform well on the actual assessment. And that's something that the report addresses. We really have to address and take a look at some of these resource inequities and how they drive some of the outcomes. And again, bring the conversation back to addressing these disparities, looking at high quality instruction, looking at analytical approaches like deeper learning so we can promote better student instruction and learning outcomes. And again, move away from tests as an end in and of themselves, because a single number, as you really noted, doesn't reflect all of these different issues, all the different factors that a student could be experiencing.
Oftentimes doesn't reflect the students in your system.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so George, same question, thinking about the
I wanted
big
to jump
picture.
into something that Janelle said when we talk about resources. Most of the curricular materials that our teachers had the past 2 years were Common Core aligned. The tests were Common Core aligned. The tests were much more rigorous than what our curricular materials were. And I think one of the pushbacks that we talk about, what our teachers were so frustrated about, was that the resources they had to help teach students was significantly less rigorous than what the students were actually assessed on at the end of the year. So I think, again, very different resource question, but a very real resource question.
All right, we need to go to the audience, but Mary Ellen first and then Mike, in terms of blue sky types of things you could see different in this new system.
Well, I think we have to be looking at different types of assessments that, number one, can be embedded in instruction, so that as you move through the year, you have embedded assessments. They give information back to teachers that can influence the approach they take in their classroom, the target and supports they give to students that they're indicating in those embedded assessments things aren't where they need to be and they need to give supports to them. I think that's an adaptive testing, I think, is extremely important. So we want to assess at the level that student should be at, but when we realize in the assessment that that's not happening, we put the child into a slot in the assessment that actually is matching more appropriately where they are, so we can find out, as you said, where they are, and we can actually see whether they've moved up as they have multiple assessment data available. And I think we have to, and we haven't touched on it, but we have special populations, our students with disabilities and our ELL students. We have to be very, very cognizant of how we assess those students, and that we're really doing something that is supporting their learning, as opposed to giving them an assessment for an assessment's sake, because ultimately is that what really brings the appropriate learning for those children. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And we're in a position where I think across this country, people have realized this has to be done. And we have to get on a better place. Sounds like you've moved that direction to get there. And I think we all have to move across the states and see what we can do in all of our districts.
Great. Mike, last word, and then we'll take some questions.
3 quick points. One is there have been a lot of good comments about what a better assessment system could look like. And I won't repeat all of them. I think they're all moving in the right direction. But I think there are 2 things we need to keep in mind here. One is there still are achievement gaps, right? We still need to know where they are, right? There still needs to be transparency, and for a variety of reasons, that will add up to what often feels like continued high stakes, right? So we shouldn't think we're going to get out of that dynamic all that easily, even if all that happens is results are made publicly available, right? It's going to be experienced in schools in some ways as high stakes. Secondly, the piece that's missing from this is there's no amount of improvement in the quality of tests that in and of itself is going to lead to improvements in learning, right? To your point about curriculum materials, right? Guarantee you that the materials that you had in your district, I have no idea what they are, but I'm willing to bet, right, that though they were asserted to be Common Core aligned, they were not, right? The best resource for Common Core aligned instructional materials is Engage New York, right? A lot of places have other stuff. They're not necessarily that good. And we don't have good mechanisms for quality control at the state or local level to make sure that the curriculum, the instructional materials that are being used in the classroom really live up to the expectations that we have of kids. And that's never going to get debated in the press the way testing issues are. It's just not that sexy an issue. But if we don't tackle that issue, we're not going to get the progress that we need.
It's great. There's a lot of follow-ups we could do, but let's take some questions from the audience. You can go, Stephanie, and then here.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for convening the panel. Stephanie Wood Garnett, the Alliance for Excellent Education. One of the questions I have is around testing process. This report also touches on that. Each of you has given examples of impact on recess and specials, et cetera. So for the Commissioner of New York, a quick question around your statement around moving towards untimed testing. Can you share some of the thinking that you're doing about how to support rollout at the school and district level for untimed tests and how students will work productively and how the educators can support the students when they're done and support the kids as they are kind of figuring out what to do when they are done?
Yeah, and that's a really important thing because, as you well know, some of the descriptions we've heard here today are specific to school sites very often, and a determination by a principal or an assistant principal that gets the job of administering the assessments in the school. So we're working through in New York a system that we have of BOCES superintendents to be available for school districts and principals to talk through what the directions would be. And we're giving our directions out to our schools across the state on that very issue. So how would you, when a student is productively working, what would be possibilities of how you would move that student to another site, another place, and then have the children that are productively working finish their tests there, or how you might do it and tell the students ahead of time. So we're giving the directives to the school on the administration of it, and we have dispersed resources throughout the state where they can call, and they're associated with those BOCES programs, so they know that that's a place they can call and get more information. But the administration of the test is a critical thing because it sets up so many opportunities for things that are unanticipated consequences for the assessment.
Question here, and then back there.
Yes, Reggie Felton Associates. This has been a stimulating conversation here. I'm at the school level. I'm looking toward the state that now has this great authority. What would you say in your memo to principals and teachers that they can do differently while you're figuring out what the state will do?
So I can tell you in New York, we have talked with principals, superintendents, school board members on approaches that they can take in getting information out to parents. I would say across this country, we're in the situation we're in because of communications. It was a huge issue in states I've had experience in, that we didn't communicate well with teachers on the use of the test, except that, it's going to be a very large percentage of your evaluation. Secondly, we didn't talk to parents very well. We didn't give a lot of information to principals and administrators, and I think that communications is a key to this. We've got to have, and not just hollow communications, but real communications. It's got to be that we are using the assessments for certain purposes and that people can have a single message about how they're using them and how it does make a difference in what they're doing to make decisions about instruction.
And can I just
Yeah,
add
please, Janelle.
really quickly to that, because the report does get into more substantive communication with parents, not just a robocall saying give your child a good breakfast the morning of the test, but really engagement throughout the process. We're examining X, Y, and Z tests. This is what will happen with your child's data on the test. Getting a real idea, because there is a fear. Will my child be penalized if they happen to perform poorly on this particular testing day? What's the purpose of the test? What are some sample questions? What's it going to say? Is there a way that parents can help prepare their children to participate in the test? Will there be ongoing open communication? And again, transparency. If you're not sure what's going on, just be honest. We really don't know. We're trying to figure out exactly what this assessment will look like. This is what our audit told us. Just more transparent, honest, ongoing engagement so that there isn't this fear. And again, I really have to say there are some really valid concerns that have been raised by the opt-out movement. It's helped to focus our energy on really trying to address what's going on with testing, where we're falling short. But as you noted, even if we really reform testing and we have these great quality assessments, that's not necessarily going to drive stronger instruction. Right. So we have to really keep the focus and keep things in perspective.
Yep. Go ahead, Chris, and then we'll be brief.
I mean, just to follow up really quickly, I think an enormous thing is to stop trying to assign blame. I mean, I think that's a real problem. You know, when the test scores are not coming back because there's an achievement gap, because of issues that we've all discussed, the knee-jerk reaction is we're going to blame the teachers because they're in the classroom with the kids. And in a larger way, we're blaming the students in their communities. That's why we're closing their schools. But I think just take a step back from blaming. I think we've tried that. In DCPS, got a little over 4,000 teachers. We replaced. I think we've hired about 3,000 or 4,000 in the last 7 years. I just think we just got to stay away from that and empower people, and reward people for working and for growth, and not looking to blame somebody.
Great. We got time for one more question. We can go in the back. Ever.
Arnie Fagey, Public Advocacy for Kids. Chris, there's been a great discussion across the board. I want to raise a number of points, and as Mike knows, I'm not a state rights person, so I come with a little bias around whether the states are up to, all of the states are up to, what Janelle was talking about is the equity issue. And if Michigan can't get the drinking water straight, how can it get Flint's education system straight? And instead of talking also about the disparity between Anacostia and Northwest, which is a real disparity, we have huge disparities between states. I need to be convinced that given the track record of many states, not all states, but many states, that the states are up to the ESSA battle, or whether we're going to come back 10 years from now and instead of talking about capacity and resources and equity and parent involvement and community engagement, we're going to continue to say, is the metrics up to snuff? Convince me.
Well, I can start on that, and others may want to weigh in. I mean, thank you. I appreciate that.
Actually, it was directed at me.
Oh, it was? Okay, well. I represent 56 state commissioners, and we're having a different conversation than we had 5 years ago about our responsibilities. And so I don't any longer hear sort of, well, we're just going to sort of leave that to the school districts and they'll figure it out. But I do think this is really at the crux of this discussion. If we sort of remove stakes, which I understand we need to do some of that, then does it become a situation where there is nobody's paying attention to what's going on in some of these schools? And so I really am worried about that. And So I come at it from that side. I also know that we do have to do a better job of not putting so much pressure on one test. So that is that is really the issue that I think our commissioners are dealing with. And I think Mary Ellen talked about it really well, that we've got to figure out ways to incorporate assessment throughout the year so that we're mining the data that's already in schools. We have to do a better job of showing what school performance actually looks like, not just use 90% of one test for the entire grade in a school. So we have that opportunity through ESSA. I think the only way that we actually see change is for locals and states to create that change. I think we've seen through No Child Left Behind of what federal control of state systems can do. It can cause states to do things, which it did, but it didn't necessarily create the improvement in those schools that we wanted. And so, in my opinion, I think we have a new opportunity here. And if we don't take it, you and I will be back here in 10 years and we will be talking about a new federal role that is more prescriptive to states. And so I think that's an opportunity for states.
Yeah, I do think,
so Mary Ellen, please.
I think we've got to, a number of things that have been said here, take the pressure off of saying you are held accountable and it's your fault, and work with teachers, because the reality of what is happening in classrooms is going to be based on the skill of the teacher. And so taking the opportunities that we have as we step back to get teachers involved across the board in developing assessments, putting the responsibility in local control, in curriculum, but making sure that we have overall a view of how well across the state our schools and our districts are doing, I think is really critical. But we've got to see that teaching should be something that, as in any career, you go in, you're a dedicated person, you're working with kids and you want them all to succeed. You get information, you use that information to get better, and the concept of continuous improvement for teachers and support for teachers to get there is critical. Every school's got to have the right curriculum, and they've got to have the right resources, and we've got to make sure that they do that, but they have to use that to support the people that are really going to make the difference, which are the teachers in every classroom across New York, and I would suggest across the country.
Mike, last comment and we wrap up.
Yeah, so, Arnie, I can't convince you, right? However, you can't convince me that there's another level of governance in the system that is better equipped, right? It's surely not the federal government, and it's not 15,000 school districts working on their own. The question, I think, is in the environment in which we're working, an environment created by ESSA reauthorization and by the Constitution, right, both federal and state, can states and districts work together to build the capacity of educators in every school to deliver results? That's the game we need to be focused on, right? And it's not going to be done by one level or another. It's going to be, as Mary Ellen said, we've got to build the capacity of teachers. We've got to give them the support that they need. In every state, that's going to involve a different combination of partnerships. But if we don't do that, right, we will be back here in 10 years.
All right, Janelle, 30 seconds, go.
I respectfully disagree. I do think that there is a very important role for the federal government to play. It doesn't have to be punitive or prescriptive like No Child Left Behind, but it is key for accountability. It's central to accountability, central to protecting the civil rights of students in this country. That's why we pushed for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 10 years, by the way, after Brown versus Board of Education, because states would not comply with federal orders to desegregate their schools. I just want to add that that is a critical role. This is also an opportunity, as someone else noted, for states to step up and do the right thing. And as the report underscores, we have to be responsive. We can't wait 10 years. We will be watching states. We'll have a role. We'll be participating, parents, students, working with you. And if you don't do the right thing, we really have to be agile and quick in our response to do something else and change course. And I think that's something that the report underscores. Let's be responsive. So when states aren't moving forward in the right way, we don't wait 10 years. We really move and institute change quickly.
So I don't think you disagreed with me. I agree completely with what you said. So, and you have something you want to add? 30 seconds, go.
I think one of the unintended consequences here is that that these policies take our eyes off children. So we use policies to close schools. So we focus on closing schools, which makes them educational transients. We blame the teachers. So we spend millions of dollars on value-added calculations and on teacher evaluations. And then, we spend millions of dollars talking about how to set up accountability systems. But then we forgot all about the students that are right in front of us. We didn't spend millions of dollars to address the achievement gap, to channel it into, to the actual educational program of the schools. We're always taking our eyes off the children. And I think that's where we have to stop and refocus and put the children first and keep our eyes on the individual students in the classroom and on what's happening there, not on trying to blame or solve at a high level. We spent millions of dollars closing schools and making students move from one to another, back and forth. And that money has left the students.
Well, that'll have to be the last word. Please join me in thanking our panel here.
That's a great point to end on.
And we look forward to further discussions about this. Our members and these folks in the room will be taking on these issues. Thanks for joining us today.